We have gathered today to speak about the origin and the evolution of the United Nations International Day of Peace, which has also come to be known as Peace Day. We all follow the pathways of those who have come before us, and part of what we will do is honor all of those as we begin to speak about the extraordinary, historic adoption of the resolution by the UN General Assembly of the United Nations in 1981 for the International Day of Peace. What is so important is that this resolution occurred during the Cold War, and this was the first time that all nations unanimously agreed to a day that was universal, that committed nations to peace and to all peoples above all differences of any kind. The origin of this occurred along several lines. Many of us have held an idea of the United Nations establishing a universal day of peace, but there's such a thing as a convergence and divine timing when an idea becomes manifested. Part of it was with the meeting that occurred shortly after the University for Peace in Costa Rica was established, largely through the efforts of Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller and the then president of Costa Rica. And it was a meeting held by the International Association of University Presidents. Others involved were, again, Robert Mueller, Dr. Robert Mueller, Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Ambassador John MacDonald, the permanent UN ambassador from Costa Rica, Amelia de Berish, and conversations with Robert about the Hopi prophecy, Hopi meaning the word for peace, and their idea that one day the prophecy would come to the glass house. This was from thousands of years ago. And that, of course, represented the United Nations, that there would be a day that would establish peace and that would become part of the legacy and the fulfillment of the prophecy. The original resolution that was proposed was that it would be called World Peace Day. It would occur on the 21st of September every year. And in order to get this passed during the Cold War, it was decided that the day would be the opening day of the UN General Assembly, which was not a fixed date, but it was always around the third Tuesday in September. So that was what helped get it passed. And also calling it the International Day of Peace, because this was incumbent upon the nations to come together and begin to work for a common purpose, which was for peace above the differences of all kinds, and to work in concert with the United Nations. This occurred through many people working with persistence, shared vision, patience, common purpose of diverse groups, divine timing, for the benefit of humanity and for the earth and for all beings and future generations. What is so important is the resolution and the wording of the resolution itself. Even though we weren't able to put in some specifics connected to, for instance, let this be a day where there is a ceasing of all forms of violence and a ceasefire that would also be a day for giving humanitarian aid to all of those in war zones. It was kept more universal, and this was actually a very wise idea because it allowed those who were involved with the divisiveness of the Cold War to agree to every single word in the resolution. This is another reason why it is so historic and why it is so even more important and universal throughout all of these 40 years. And this year represents the 40th anniversary of the adoption of the resolution establishing the International Day of Peace. The resolution that you are seeing on screen, one of the significant parts of that is that it calls upon not only all the United Nations as an entity, but also all member states and all of humanity to promoting the ideals of peace and to giving positive evidence of their commitment to peace in all viable ways. This allows, by the way, a great interpretation of different approaches to peace at all different levels. Another part is that it asks that this day, the International Day of Peace, shall be devoted to commemorating and strengthening the ideals of peace, both within and among all nations and all peoples. And that is of great significance because it allows the role of civil society and every human being in all organizations, whether they be regional, governmental, or whatever, NGOs, CBOs, whatever they are, to participate in their own way to peace above all differences of any kind. And this was at the 77th plenary meeting on 30 November 1981. Truly an historic moment. And I'm now going to speak about how this one day and how a minute of peace expanded into very quickly Peace Weekend, Peace Week, Peace Month, and then into a movement, a global movement toward building a culture of peace for the benefit of all and future generations. And that includes our relationship with the earth as well. I called a dear longtime colleague and friend who is Robert Miller and asked him what was happening on the International Day of Peace for 1982 with the United Nations. And he said that the only thing that was happening is the traditional minute of silence that begins the UN General Assembly every year in September. So the decision was made that Pathways to Peace would initiate something called the Peace Wave. And the Peace Wave is a minute of silence, moment of peace at noon in every time zone. And we collaborated with different organizations in San Francisco, the birthplace of the United Nations. And everyone agreed that they would participate in this and spread the word to all of those that they knew. So at noon, which was at the opening of the General Assembly at the United Nations at 3 p.m. East Coast time, we established the beginning of the Peace Wave. And we also agreed that we would do this every day on the 21st of September and be able to connect in a simple act of peace through this Peace Wave with different people throughout the world for this 24 hours, so that would link humanity in this sort of unitive action of peace. And this could be done at any level, in any way, in any manner that people chose. And we also suggested that this be done in a way that also brought in other members of the community, if possible. And that began the Peace Wave, which actually that year was on the 21st of September in 1982, kind of a divine coincidence. In 1983, we understood that there was still not much occurring within the United Nations or anywhere else. So we began in San Francisco to work with our sister city in Assisi, Italy, and to begin the building of an event that would be in 1984, that would be on the International Day of Peace, that would be intergenerational, intercultural, interfaith, and that it would honor all the different constituents within that community or that city and involve them in the planning process. So we began in 1983 convenings that brought together the mayor of San Francisco, the board of supervisors, representatives from different organizations, including business, the military, humanitarian organizations, and on and different religions, on it goes. And what was so extraordinary was there was such a readiness for people to come together who ordinarily would never meet, and they met together with such goodwill and loved that there was a purpose that they could share in common and co-create in common. And that led to what was going to happen in 1984, again in San Francisco with our sister city of Assisi, Italy, and different people and United Nations organizations and all of that, associations rather, began to connect with their sister cities and with their networks around the world. And an event happened in San Francisco that was all done by volunteers with the support of the city of San Francisco, the mayor of San Francisco, the board of supervisors, Parks and Recreation, and just on and on it went. And it was so extraordinary that there was such support and diversity within that. There was a flag ceremony, there were speeches by various people representing different organizations, and there was a vigil at Grace Cathedral that began with the Indigenous ceremony for the International Day of Peace, and then involved people from all different pathways of different religions and faiths to be able to present what they were doing in prayer and ceremony at Grace Cathedral for this vigil. And you will see from the slides that are being presented that there was great diversity and that most of the attendance was broadcast by television, local television. And then what also was so important was that at noon, there was the peace wave. And even businesses stopped what they were doing. The entire government of San Francisco stopped for a minute, and KRON TV and NBC affiliate broadcast the Minute of Silence. It was the first time that a minute of silence has ever been broadcast over radio and television, ever. And the local newspaper, the leading newspaper actually in San Francisco, said it was the silence that was heard around the world. And that has continued to be carried on. And then fast forward to 1986 at the United Nations, where it was also the International Year of Peace, proclaimed by the United Nations. And there was an invitation by the Office of the Secretary General that representatives of the United Nations non-governmental organization, certain organizations be invited, along with representatives from certain cities that had taken part in the International Day of Peace beginning in 1984. I forgot to mention, by the way, in 1984, this was again before internet, and so only by voicemails, by faxes, by telephone calls, and by letters did the International Day of Peace in 1984 was participated in by individuals of over 70 nations. 3 entire nations dedicated the entire day to the International Day of Peace, including Costa Rica, Canada, and Italy. And there were some others that I've forgotten at the moment, but that became also historic. And at the end of that year, we presented the activities that had happened during 1984 to the Office of the Secretary General. Returning back to 1986, the Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller, and the President of the General Assembly, with the ringing of the peace bell, began a very special ceremony where they inaugurated something called the Peace Messenger Awards. And these Peace Messenger Awards would go to non-governmental organizations and to cities who had already made the International Day of Peace so significant. And the city of San Francisco was one of the cities awarded that. And Pathways to Peace and several other organizations were given that award. And that became a separate kind of supportive movement for making certain that the International Day of Peace became more recognized and commemorated within the United Nations system itself and within humanity at large. And the International Association of Peace Messenger Organizations and Cities became very, very active for many years until it was ended somewhere around 1990, I believe. What is so important now is that what began as 1 minute and 1 day of peace by 1986 had become 1 week of peace and 1 month of peace. And that has turned into a global movement where it is self-organizing. It is something that has involved citizens and all nations involving themselves in whatever way they have deemed appropriate to engage in and make certain that the International Day of Peace is the annual highlight day. And this has been positioned now since 1984, actually, as the annual highlight day where we mark our individual and collective process toward building a culture of peace in all viable ways. And then on that day, to honor and celebrate that. And then on that day, to make a commitment above all difference of any kind to, again, be able to advance and increase our commitment so that it becomes enough of a day that Peace Day is every day so that we can change the course of history from a culture of war and violence to a culture of peace. There are many other years to point to, and others on this call, on this webinar will do so. I will conclude with a beautiful quote from Nicholas Roerich, an extraordinary peace builder, philosopher, and so much more than that. Positive creativeness is the fundamental quality of the human spirit. Let us welcome all those who, surmounting personal difficulties, propel their spirits to the task of peace building, thus ensuring a radiant future. End quote. May peace prevail on earth. May everyone be a path to peace building, to build a culture of peace for the benefit of all and future generations. And may the spirit of peace be in our hearts and spread throughout the world, not only on the International Day of Peace, but on every day, Peace Day every day. Thank you.